Hi guys. All right, so we're going to learn more about Central America and the Caribbean. So similar to our own history, they had early civilizations and Native American people. And so they, for example, in Central America, they had Native Americans that were known as Maya, and they began settling in what's now Guatemala. So the Mayan culture was amazing. They had this incredibly accurate calendar and this system of writing that used symbols, and they were skilled at math, and they were architects and astronomists, and they did a bunch of weaving and sculpting, and they were just really amazing. They grew corn and a lot of other crops. They used irrigation to help those crops get water. They were organized into basically city states, so each one had its own ruler, and there was a lot of issues with conflicts with that, but trade helped, so the different places being able to trade was huge. They had these amazing temples that were built for religious celebrations to honor all of the Mayan gods. They studied the stars and the planets, so they had many gods that they honored and worshipped. They also had spaces where they played like some kind of unique ball game that's really fascinating. But around 900 AD, their civilization started to rapidly decline. We don't entirely know what happened, but we think it was a combination of wars. We think maybe some of their crops failed, and that they started having some environmental problems like those, like storms or droughts or things that we know happen now. In the Caribbean islands, we also had a lot of native groups. There were two main ones, the Arawak and the Carib, and they grew a whole bunch of different things. They had fruit that they gathered from trees. They did a lot of fishing in the sea and had a lot of shellfish. They used canoes to travel from island to island and do trade and things like that. And the islands were divided into villages that were ruled by chiefs. So they were doing pretty well, but then in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic and arrived in the Bahamas. So the Spanish explorers who followed him basically started establishing colonies very similar to what we know happened in America. They took natural resources and they either enslaved the native people that they found there, or they just straight up killed them. The early Spanish explorers also came. They were looking for gold and riches, and they had this dream of converting all of the native people there to Christianity. And so they formed a colony in what's now Panama. And they basically established this legal system called encomienda, I think, or something like that, encomienda, that basically said that it was completely okay to take all the native people and make them slaves as long as they still taught them Christianity. But really quickly they stopped teaching them anything about Christianity, and they were just slaves. The Spanish landowners also created what they called haciendas, which were these huge farms and ranches. And a lot of native people ended up dying from disease or abuse. And so the Spanish people then just started importing African slaves. So by the 1600s, we also had European countries that had formed colonies on the Caribbean islands. And they grew giant cash crops, especially sugarcane, which required a lot of workers. And so they really started getting these African slaves in. They traded sugar, slaves, rum, tobacco, and molasses in the triangular trade that ended up happening between the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. And the Europeans on all sides of this were getting unbelievably rich. The native people began to start not being okay with the way things are. to the extent of plotting and fighting back. And so basically in the 1800s, everything kind of exploded. In Haiti, there was a giant uprising, and they had years of fighting. Many people died, but they were able to declare their independence and rename their area Haiti. Similarly, the Kingdom of Guatemala, they declared their independence from Spain. And so basically within a few years, a lot of Central America tried to form what they called the United Provinces of Central America. But they really struggled because they had so many political differences and there were all these arguments all the time. And so basically they then broke back up into independent countries. So after finding their independence, a lot of them realized they needed a lot of help to get things set up. And so they ended up asking for foreign countries to really come and support them, to invest in them. And so over time, they really became dependent on other countries, mainly the United States. So like United States investors would come in and they would rebuild, and they would take control of the industries like sugar and coffee and bananas, and they would take over land and they would build these enormous plantations, and basically we ended up gaining control of the land in Panama, and we built the Panama Canal, which ended up being a huge trade thing. There was problem still at this point though, because while we did help them grow economically, like democracy was still a huge issue there. They might have been independent, but it was not going great politically. They ended up having a lot of dictatorships, which is basically like all the decisions are being made by one person, and it gets really corrupt really fast. And so, for example, in Cuba, we had a dictator named Batista. He limited political freedom pretty intensely, but he did show a lot of economic growth in the area. However, we ended up having a huge uprising from Fidel Castro, who basically kicked the other guy out and took his place. And so when he did that, America was kind of like, nope, I'm not feeling that. And so we ended our relationships with Cuba and stopped helping at that point. And so really by the late 1900s, the people that lived there, they were so frustrated with dictatorships. And so you started having these mini rebellions happening all throughout the area. But the problem is that the rebellions would win, and then the people that were in charge of the rebellion would end up forming another dictatorship. So it was just really, really complicated. And even though the economy was much more stable, they really needed to start focusing on how they were going to make the money, or not the money, but the democracy come together so that they could really live in the way that they wanted to live. So that is where we're at with this chapter. Thanks.